This meeting is being recorded.
So, I guess without further ado, Victor, you still here? I don't know. Should we make any
Yeah,
announcements? Uh, this is
yeah,
actually this is my group, and Lance's group, the Northwest AGI Forum and the Philosophy Club. So Victor's from the Philosophy Club, and Lance, you know Victor anyway. Elizabeth, you probably seen Lance around and such.
yeah, yeah. Mike, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm testing now just for future reference. I'm testing using a screen recorder here locally and to see if it works,
Oh,
so we
okay.
can it's to see for future reference.
You mean
So
that?
anyway, it's independent of what you're doing, so it's only using my computer, and to see if we can do this without Zoom
Okay.
in the future. Anyway,
Yeah. Okay.
but yeah, I'll let you know how it goes.
Okay. Let me. Why don't we just get started then, since everybody's taking time out of their weekend. I So I mean, the reason that air conditioners making some noise, the reason that somebody already left again. Hate that noise. Okay, I'm just gonna try to proceed forward. Okay, the way I think of thinking is understanding, reasoning, and judging. And the the Northwest AGI Forum, we've covered understanding and judging in a reasonable amount of detail. We haven't done okay. We covered understanding and judging. We haven't covered reasoning yet. So I kind of had envisioned call it a two event series of reasoning. The first one being just some kind of starting point, some kind of orientation, some kind of overview of reasoning. And the second one, I started the slides again. I'm calling them slides. But for the second one on uh, reasoning, I want to start with kind of the beginnings of AI through kind of like a middle era of cognitive architectures, and then on through large models to where we're at now. So the goal of the reasoning series is pretty much to get an idea for okay, what is reasoning in the big scheme of things, and how's it being implemented now. So I mean, maybe you can come up with some ideas. It helps to talk to others and look at the big picture, and then you can use what you need. Today being Sunday, it's a good day to philosophize, and a lot of this, what we're going to start off with, is not going to apply to AI right away. But it's good for perspective if you're not in a hurry to get anywhere in particular. Um, so yeah, just to gain a greater perspective of reasoning, rationality, and logic. So I am gonna adjust my. I was trying to come up with some like a basic starting definition that would be kind of broad, just to get people's minds, wrapped around this. And uh, so here's an example definition. Reasoning is the process of inference. It's the process of passing from certain propositions already known or assumed to be true to another truth distinct from them but following from them. So I mean, I kind of envision reasoning as you're starting with this kind of set of things that you know, and how do you okay, by what mechanism, by what means, and by what justification do you get to the next thing that that's relevant at the time. So you've got you're dealing with some situation, maybe you're reading, maybe you're walking, driving, whatever, interacting, and you've got all this information. How do you get to the next important thing that's relevant? And that's kind of a basic upper level overview of reasoning. Rationality is more like is closely related, but in my starter definition anyway, I was rationality is more like, okay, the quality of how do you get to the next thing that's important? How do you get to the next known piece of information? It's what strategy are you planning on using? So rationality is more like the quality of the reasoning. So that's kind of the way I look at the starter definition. Now, okay, so just to try to look at from some of this from an historical background from uh, the one problem with this is if we want to go back to the beginning of reasoning, I mean it's going to run off the end of the uh, measuring stick because no, I don't think anyone was around. Well, people were around, but there was nobody writing down how reasoning started. There was no guy that said, okay, it started this way and that's what we're doing. So, but we can kind of look to some of the, I mean, well, one place to look is to the, for example, the Greek philosophers, in particular, Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist. Let me just share an image here. And so can everybody see that big green tire? Okay, I'm guessing you probably can. Anyway, um, the reason I bring this up here is that the way Plotinus described kind of the origins of reality or the origins of everything, the universe, what have you, is that the way he viewed it was that there was this one thing, this that was kind of a conjunction of truth, beauty, goodness, and unity all rolled up into one. And he actually kind of envisioned this in a kind of a circular way, and that this tire with the the circular uh, structure looks kind of like the letter O kind of being one. So I mean, I realize this is a very crude depiction of the start of the universe, but nevertheless, I mean, it's kind of what Plotinus had in mind. He's thinking of this. There's this one unified good truth, and he wasn't alone in this thinking in the medieval period. So basically, uh, we've all got some one good and unity within us that kind of all roll up into this grandiose first starter, first cause green tire, which just depicts which looks pretty strange, but when you think about it, I mean, our first principles don't go further than the beginning of the universe. They bottom out. We can't go back to what was the creator of the creator, and you get into an infinite regress like that. Okay. So anyway, um, where I was going with this is that Plotinus had the notion that from this original starting point of everything came reason and rationality. I'll get rid of the tire here. And okay, let me just adjust something. So basically, Plotinus had this idea and it's kind of like God. There's this one thing that's all wrapped up in it. It's the source of everything. And from that came out nous, Nous, which is a kind of a classic Greek, or I think it came from the Greek origin. Not sure about that, but it basically that nous, Nous means to be able to reason and think rationally. So there's a little, there's one, you know, if that's the best theory of how reasoning came out, it should tell you something we don't really know that much. So we have to use it like an old green tire. Plato in his so Plato was prior, like by about 700 years, of course, to Plotinus. Plotinus was a Neoplatonist, but I thought his view was pretty instructive or a good starter. But in Plato's Timaeus, I think is where it's pronounced. The universe starts out as like this huge mess, but fortunately, there's what the demiurge, Plato says there's a demiurge, so-called divine craftsman, which comes along and fortunately uh, constructs or helps to construct the whole. He's like this divine craftsman that helps to construct the universe in a rational fashion. So, I mean, rationality, reason, so came from this demiurge, according to Plato. Now, so much for the ancient Greek philosophy. I'm going to give you some of my own views on this. In 2013, I published a book which I linked to in the slides, and there's a chapter in there which I identify, which I've got some of my own hypothetical reasoning about where my own hypothetical reasoning about where reasoning originated. So basically, I've got like a half a dozen requirements for reasoning, just to some. In order to reason, we've got to use memory. So any agent, any person, whatever, there's got to be some reasoning involved. It can't just be right now. We have to have a capacity to hold multiple reasons, conscious reflection. And if you guys could mute your microphones, that'd be great. So I covered memory. And second one, we have this capacity for conscious reflection and abstraction where we can hold more than one reason at once. So that's really required for reasoning. That's a requirement for reasoning. And I think perhaps most importantly, I'm going to try to figure out who's talking.
It's Daniel. I think your mic.
Okay, I'll just give a mute there. Okay. Oops, let me, one moment, please.
It's muted.
Okay. Before I lose my train of thought. So basically, a really important component of reasoning, in my view, and it's pretty obvious, is that you have to go beyond sense impressions. So it's not just the immediate sense input. In order to really reason, you've got to be able to go beyond that. And you have to, at some point, have a capacity to generalize, to say that some property is present in more than one instance that you see, and create universals, or in particulars, all things of this nature have such and such property, and kind of be able to chain these together using whatever logic you want, or whatever, however our minds actually work, which I guess Jim was looking at the psychological origins. But so those are just some kind of, points I bring up, some kind of requirements for what you would basically need for some kind of reasoning. It's not just sense input. There's abstractions, there's generalizations, there's universals going on. So I was able to find a couple of influential scholarly papers on hypothetical origins of reasoning. One, which seemed to be kind of the paper at one point everybody was talking about, Mercier, 2011. And basically, he argues that reasoning is a cognitive mechanism aimed at social interaction. And that, again, he does say, this is where I got, reasoning is a conscious process. And he argues that one of the main need, I think, according to what he was arguing, was that we need reasoning in order to persuade somebody else. So that's one reason why reasoning exists, is because it's hard to persuade somebody to do anything if you can't at some point appeal to their reasoning. And so that was his basic argument. In contrast to that, I looked at another paper by Norman, I believe published after the paper I already mentioned by Mercier. Norman argues, well, yeah, that's true, but really the reason, well, maybe I shouldn't keep saying reason, but why reasoning evolved is because we need to work as a team. And so if I'm working on a team with somebody towards some kind of shared goal, I have to be able to convey my reasons as far as why we're going to do something. And what the result of this is that what he says is that reasons typically overwrite non-aligned mental states with aligned mental states by showing the need for belief change. I like that line. And basically, okay, so you're talking to somebody else, you're exchanging reasons why we should do something, and then your reasons can align. Now, you're also probably going to have to employ rhetoric. And so Norman called rhetoric car salesman reasoning, which we can relate to. But so to me, I mean, reasoning came about because we need to work together with somebody often as a team, but we also need to convince them of things. And in order to do that, we need to give them the reasons. That's reasoning, according to some of these earlier definitions. Okay. So how am I doing? Well, I'm going to take a kind of a brief look at Plato and Aristotle here for a second. And according to Plato, in an interpretation I read by George Klosko, he argues that he's interpreting Plato, and basically he's saying that Plato compares the reasoning in the soul with reasoning in the just city. So in the just city of Plato's structure or whatever, we have different components operating in a rational and reasonable fashion, and that's what enables it to function as a city. So Plato also says that same kind of principle is going on in the soul with these different parts of your mentality or whatever. they're all working together to help you to work. That's reason and rationality. And basically, he talks about, Plato talks about motivations in kind of a Hume fashion, where Hume said, okay, and it's a great quote by Hume. He says, reason should only be the slave of the passions. And so Plato takes, according to Klosko's interpretation, Plato takes a similar stance, and he says that, well, people reason because they're either a lover of wisdom and they want to reason their way to wisdom. They love honor. They want to find some way to gain honor. Maybe they're a warrior or something, or they want to become rich. So the reason is used, in to achieve goals, according to Plato. Now, Aristotle came after Plato, of course, and I can relate to this division. Aristotle basically divides the soul into two parts for a human. You got the rational and the irrational, and it's kind of easy to relate to because it seems like, at least with me anyway, they're usually in some kind of a fight. But he, he basically argues that man is the, quote, rational animal, and that the irrational part can oppose this rational part and run counter to reason. And so it's like you've got the good angel and the bad angel, and the animals just have the bad angel, they don't have the good angel. So there's this constant tug of war going on. But according to Aristotle, the good man's more likely to follow um, the rational side. So okay, trying to get through this anyway. I logic is not without controversy, and so if it's something is not without controversy, you get a philosophy of, or whatever it is. So there's a philosophy of logic, and I'm just going to highlight some of the some of the topics that I think are relevant, or within logic, to give you guys something to think about or whatever. So in general, we like to have logic being topic neutral and normative, so that it helps a lot if we kind of all agree on the structure of logic in general, irrespective of what the context is. If everybody has some different crazy definition of logic, it's not going to work that well. So that's kind of the centerpiece, the engine of rational behavior and reasoning. So there are two basic classifications of logic from what I can gather. And I'm not a logic scholar. I just gleaned a lot of this information. But there's formal logic, in which we're just talking about the bare bones structure of logic, that you could be using made up terms or whatever, but as long as the made up terms follow some kind of mechanism that we all agree on works, that's the important part. There's informal logic, where the emphasis is more like on why you happen to introduce some kind of premises at what point. So they're both kind of necessary. The informal and the formal, there's interplay, and I think Victor knows more about this anyway. And there are three basic divisions of logic. There's the classical logic, there is extended logic, and there's deviant logic. And classical logic is basically what you get in college with Logic 101. So there's basically the emphasis with classical logic is Boolean. You've got your and or nots, and there are required laws that you have to follow with classical logic, that A equals A. This drink is this drink. There's the law of non-contradiction. I guess an example might be, well, it's sunny today, but it can't also be not sunny. You're stuck with this crisp. It's got to be either this or it's not that. There's no in between. So, and there's no middle of that. The middle is excluded. There's an excluded middle. You can't be both sunny and cloudy. That doesn't work with classical logic. The second main branch of logic, extended logic, where you take that pretty firm but very crisp and a little too brittle classic logic, and you start adding things on top, like this is where modal logic comes from, I believe. You had things like temporal logic. You've got necessity, possibility, and you can study this. Spend your whole life studying these higher order versions of logic, which are again based upon that they don't violate the rules. At the bottom, there's still classical logic. Okay, now deviant logic came along 1970. Wine, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. I've seen it before, but that's logic that is that's got some incompatibility with classical logic. So, so if it's sunny today, it can't be cloudy according to classical logic, but maybe there's a little bit of clouds. So I mean, you're violating some, one of these core principles. I mean, to me, and this is where some of the controversies come about with these kinds of arguments. Now, just a couple of more things to say about the philosophy of logic. And again, this is just a really big, broad overview. Truth. We've got what I see here, what I gathered was we've got formal logic, we've got factual logic, moral logic, and fictional logic. Excuse me, start that over. We've got formal truth, factual truth, moral truth, and fictional truth. I think I did that right. Going a little too fast here. But it's still controversial. What is truth? I mean, it's a pretty deep concept right there. Okay, so you can't talk about logic unless you're talking about inference. And I think as most people know, we usually think of this in two ways. There's deduction and there's induction. And they're both deduction and induction are ways of proceeding from what you know, like I was trying to describe earlier, to some new piece of relevant information. With deduction, though, you're not really coming up with something truly new. You're just like, you've got this logic base, this context, this set of things that are happening. And from that, you use rules to come up with something that might be enlightening, but it's already kind of in your rules and your context. So that's deduction. Inductive thinking is where you come up with something that really is new. So you have to. This is an ampliative form of inference. You take what you have. You take, for instance, a bunch of cases, and then you say what's common to all of those things. You really learn in induction. You really do get something that's actually new. So deduction and induction, but only induction really gets you to something that's new. And most people know fallacies pretty well. That's part of the philosophy of logic. Fallacies I think of as, I mean, somebody's arguing something at you, and they're trying to cheat somehow, or they don't realize they're cheating. Like there's two types of fallacies. There's formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Formal fallacies would be like you violated one of the core structural laws. So if you sneak in your conclusion into one of your premises that are supposed to lead to the conclusion, that's called begging the question, and that's a fallacy, and people do that. In the informal type of fallacy is more like when you, for example of that would be like you object to somebody's argument on the grounds that they don't happen to be an expert in what they're talking about. Their argument might be perfectly valid, but you just say, I don't believe you just because you're of you, but it has nothing to do with what they're actually arguing. All right. So how am I doing for time? Pretty well, I guess. Now I'm going to turn to another very small slide. Practice this a little bit. Okay, hang on a second. Oops. One moment, please. Do this. Okay. Share one screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my little. Get rid of that. Okay. So this right here is just your good old typical syllogism, which we've all seen. And I realize there's nothing new here, but I just want to bring it up for illustrating purposes. And basically, as most people know, there's always three terms in this kind of classical term logic. The minor term, which is typically going to be the the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term does not appear in the conclusion, and the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So, and here we have just a very simple example. Tulip is a plant. All plants need water. Therefore, this tulip needs water. So, and everybody, that's pretty simple to understand. There's nothing really new about this. But the point that I wanted to make was that, first of all, let me back up just for 1 second, because basically in classical logic, we have three different kinds of logic. We have term logic, which is illustrated with this example, which this example illustrates. There's which Aristotle pretty much invented. There's propositional logic, which is long propositions that hook together by laws. I think the Stoics championed that. And then both term logic and propositional logic are really old. They go back to the Greeks. Predicate logic is a lot newer, first order logic. But the criticism against term logic and predicate logic is that the problem is that they can't quantify very well, and they're also kind of difficult and cumbersome. But one advantage of term logic in particular that I like is that it's close to natural language, and it's very simple. Basically, I mean, if you read Aristotle, he had hundreds of pages of these three-term syllogisms, which in many different kinds of varieties, and so it's basically simple, and it's got, according to a book that I have seen and read some of, there's a scholar named Terence Parsons, which argues that if you add on some more functionality to term logic, without dramatically altering it, you can actually get a lot of richness and power, which is comparable to predicate logic. So it gave me some hope that, because I've always liked term logic, it gave me some hope that I wasn't just wasting my time. So I wanted to mention that first, that term logic, well, whereas it's got a reputation of being limited, it's actually arguably not so limited, that it's highly functional. Anyway, so earlier on, I was talking about those requirements for reasoning. And I mentioned you had to have memory, and you had to be able to hold multiple reasons in conscious reflection. And you had to go beyond, you had to, your whole experience of reasoning had to go beyond just the initial sense impression. You had to have the capability of inference. And at some point, you're going to have to be able to generalize and have, grasp of universality. So those were kind of the constituent parts that I see in reasoning. And the reason I bring this, I put all these pieces, I want to try to put some pieces together here, is that it's easy for me to look at the structure of the syllogism and see all of these things kind of leaping out of the syllogism, if you will. I mean, you have to use memory, because in order to determine that a tulip is a plant, you have to have a memory of seeing prior cases of tulips being plants. And in order to really run through the chain of a syllogism where tulip is a plant needs water, you've got to have this capacity for holding all these things in conscious reflection. And causality is in here too. Why do you need water? Why does the plant need water? Well, I mean, why does the tulip need water? It's because it's a plant, is what I meant to say. So the plant is kind of, the middle term here is kind of like a causative agent for why it needs water. And generality in here, universality. So, I mean, basically, you can't, if you're going to reason, again, you can't just go from the initial sense impressions. You can't just see this flower. It has to be a flower that you've seen other cases. I mean, it has to be a kind of flower that you were able to generalize as a plant. And it took some intelligence to do that. I mean, most animals maybe instinctively, or maybe they did learn that a tulip is a plant. But yeah, so we're not alone in this capacity. But what we can do pretty well is bring in those other aspects of reasoning where we're not just connected to the sense impression. We can sit back and put these ideas together and say we can develop a universal. The universal is all plants need water. We didn't get that just from the flower that we're looking at right now. So, and then given some flower that we're looking at, we can chain these things together, see the causality, see the inference chain. A tulip, this tulip needs water. So I guess the reason I bring up this term logic, first of all, I've always liked term logic. But anyway, I just think it's good for as an illustrative aspect for what I'm trying to explain. Okay, I think I made my point there. And let me get out of that for a second. I'm just trying to get through here before I use up all the time. So okay, I think I'll keep going. So now I'm going to pass to theories of rationality. Now, rationality, as I was trying to argue before, was kind of like the strategy of reasoning. So the quality of reasoning, it makes more sense to think of, if you're going to reason, you just can't get to the next term by whatever means. There has to be some kind of strategy involved. And some of the main theories of rationality, one is called reason responsiveness, that your behavior is rational if you're acting intentionally due to some specific known reason. So if you're getting into some situation, you know what the reasons are, you're behaving according to the reasons, that's rational. The quality of your reasoning is rational. Another theory is internal coherence, where you might have this internal idea of what you want to happen, and it has to, these pieces of the situation all have to cohere in a structure that makes sense. So it can't be both Wednesday and Thursday. It has to be just Wednesday. If you thought that today was Wednesday and Thursday, then you lack coherence. So it would be irrational. If you are, another theory of rationality, if you're pursuing your goals, that's rational behavior. If you're looking out for your own good, that's rational behavior. There's a couple of other ones here worth mentioning. Internalism versus externalism. You're behaving rationally under internalism if your behavior is consistent with what your beliefs are. So if I think that if I have an idea about a certain type of behavior, a certain type of moral behavior, and my actions are consistent with my internal beliefs, that's internalism. So externalism, kind of the opposite. Actually, I didn't study that enough, so I don't think I'm going to comment on it. But another theory of rationality just rolls up under called normativity. So you're thought to be behaving rationally if you're following classical logic, for example. So if somebody asks you why you did something, you just give them the reason as it follows from the facts and the logic. And another theory of reasoning, this is the last one in this batch, is basically comes down to you just follow the most well-known, the well-trod pattern of behavior and rules that everybody else has been following all along. So if we've always done it this way, then we're just going to keep doing this way, keep on doing whatever it is this way until some new reason comes along that says we've got to change our rational behavior. And I guess I can go through there's 12 concepts of rationality according to Mario Bunge. I'll just kind of whip through these. We've got you're rational if you minimize vagueness and maximize exactness. If you're consistent, you're rational. If you conform to deduction, you're rational. If you're in some kind of, maybe you're talking to somebody, you stay within the context, that's rational. If you tend to use good theories in your behavior, you question people, you justify, you say, have you got the proof for that, and things of that nature, that's rational. If you are usually looking for facts to support your behavior, that's rational. If your goals are really worthwhile, if you're not just wasting your time, that's rational behavior. If you're able to follow a consistent pattern of preferences, so this is called pro-heretic rationality, where if you prefer A to B and B to C, and you also prefer A to C, there's a rational pattern to that. So that's rational. Anyway, if you if your behavior is consistent with the desire to create a more moral society, that's another type of rational behavior. If you pick means that are going to probably lead to the ends that you desire, that's rational. If you are looking out for your own self-interest instead of everybody else's, that's rational. And I encourage you to, there's in the archive, Hugo Latapy came up with a few more reasons, which I neglected to copy down at the moment, but they're pretty good. So anyway, that's kind of like a really whiz bang, tour through what's supposed to be rational. Okay. So having covered rationality, there's okay, human life is not always so rational, and there's classifications and names for that too. And one, irrational. So the irrational is behavior, actions, and events that this is normal too, that just don't follow from logical reasoning. An example is your mood. So you wake up today, you're thinking, it's maybe it's Saturday, I should be in a good mood, I don't have to work. You're in a bad mood. You think, well, that's not rational. The problem is your moods don't follow rationality. They're irrational. Who you happen to fall in love with. I mean, some people would, say, well, it's because the person I fell in love with has a lot of money or a lot of prestige or something like that. And then make an argument from those reasons that, and that rational kind of behavior that you should get married to him. Well, the hell with that. I mean, you might not be actually in love with him, because love doesn't tend to really be rational. And if it is, it's probably not love. Music, art, politics. Some people just take crazy risks. I mean, these are all things that are part of human behavior that don't fall within rational behavior. And but if something is plainly just incorrect, it just violates too much our kind of laws of rationality. There's a certain area that if you go too far beyond seemingly rational behavior, it's irrational, which is kind of defined here as inside the domain of rational evaluation, but not for fulfilling its standards. Okay, so I'm just about done here. The only other point I want to make about that is that, so I looked at irrational, irrational. There's also insane behavior, and none of these are really rational. But whether someone's being irrational, irrational, or insane, I don't know, and I don't know what the boundaries are, and I think it would be very hard to find out. And to me, rationality has a certain limit. Wittgenstein had a pretty famous quote: "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." So basically, he says that there is a boundary, but within rationality. But if you go too far from sense impressions, too many extrapolations, you go too far, you fall off the edge. Rationality has got a limit, and it doesn't apply beyond a certain aspect. And Wittgenstein and philosophers of that era, they didn't really like metaphysics that much. Spinoza went really far with rationality. I think he's reputed to have gone so far. Nietzsche said he was using a mathematical.
It was just enough webinar.
Well, I hear somebody talking, but this brings me to my conclusion anyway. So just to wrap everything up, reasoning is kind of like the mechanical aspect of going from some set of things that you know to something new. Rationality is your strategy and form of reasoning. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening that long, those of you who stuck with it. And
well done, Mike.
oh,
Good
thank you.
job. Good coverage. All sorts of aspects to reasoning. Love it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. It's that, it means a lot, to me.
Did you say that, did you just define rationality as a strategy?
I think it is.
Could you say that again? Because I've already forgotten it. So,
What you could do, you could also just click on in the chat that it should bring up these what I was previously calling slides, which just turned into a mass of writing. My definition: rationality is the quality of reasoning, being guided by reasoning, the strategy of reasoning. But I think I basically stole that from a lot of it from Wikipedia, but some of it was mine, I think. Does anybody else? I'm not a great moderator. If is Elizabeth? Does anybody want to volunteer to moderate? I don't know. I guess I can moderate.
I don't mind moderating, Mike, if there's lots of questions.
Yeah, if there's lots of. So does anybody have any comments, Victor? Anybody?
I have an
Yeah.
idea, or go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just reading about Gödel's incompleteness theorem in mathematics, which basically states that any given set of axioms, well, given a set of axioms, there are true factual statements, mathematical statements that are true but cannot be proved. I'm wondering if this is also true of just rationality in general. That there might be statements that are true but cannot be proved. Curious what people think.
Any volunteers?
Well, if I could speak up, I mean, in logic, what you call the core of reasoning, at least some philosophers think it is. Well, its fundamental principles are not themselves provable. They're just axioms. They're just taken like the law of excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction. You can't prove those with the tools of logic, because all the things you can do with logic rely on them. It's like lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's so the basic rules of logic are. Aristotle famously said he took the law of non-contradiction to be so basic that, and I believe he used this expression. He says, if you don't get it, you're a vegetable. And he didn't. It's beyond. You can't, if you have to explain it why it makes sense, then you're impossible. You can't be convinced of anything. However, more recent logicians have questioned that and said you can actually operate pretty well without that rule, or at least without the strict application of it. Or you could devise an alternative kind of law that permits the possibility for some contradictions to actually be true. That's, I think, Mike, I sent you a link to what's his name? Can't remember his name right off. He's a contemporary comparative logician who is very familiar with Western logic, but also with Buddhist logic and other cultural logics from around the world. He's like the authority on comparative logics. And he said it's not that uncommon. Half of humanity operates on different fundamental rules about reasoning. It doesn't mean they're in that because in other words, it's not fatal to the practical application of logic if you decide to dump one of these basic rules. That you have to replace it with something else, but it's not written in stone somehow that you have to accept the law of non-contradiction. And you might ask, well, how is that possible? Well, it's partly because we, in the West, at least since Aristotle's time, we've come to accept like the idea that it can't be raining and not raining at one and the same time, or which is a violation of the law of non-contradiction. See what they call it, dialetheist. That's what the name is for a logician who denies the law of non-contradiction. Says that yeah, most of the time contradictions are to be avoided. However, there are some contradictions that are perfectly acceptable. In fact, we operate on them all the time. an example he gives is that, for example, well, okay, for logic to be applicable to the real world, there have to be situations in the real world to which those rules of logic apply. And in many situations, the law of non-contradiction does apply. But there are many other important situations in life where um, things can be both, opposite things at once. An example of this in human experience are things like love, hate, bitter, sweet, things that are actually opposite to each other. Or Hegel is an example of a dialethicist. He had the idea that there can actually be contradictions that are true. And there are many other philosophers too, even outside the Western traditions, who accepted the possibility that some contradictions can be true. Now, knowing when it's okay and when it's not is tricky, but it's not a blanket prohibition on contradictory statements. At least that you can have a system of logic that functions very well in the real world without a strict law of non-contradiction. Anyway, that was.
Brett's got his hand up.
Yeah,
Brett.
yeah. A question for anybody, including Mike. Do you think that we learn how to do reasoning? I think reasoning is learnt. In other words, does a baby who's just been born, is it able to reason? Or is it
I
something that
think
we
it
learn?
is. Yeah, I think it's definitely learned. I mean, you might have a baby might know how to do reasoning, but they don't know how to do it well. So it's definitely not rational, except for some maybe basic instincts. But it's questionable if that's due to reasoning or not. It's just so I think reasoning is definitely learned. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think,
I'd agree.
especially if they want something, they'll maybe not baby, but toddler might be able to give a rational argument for something, a very simple rational argument. They become more complex as they get older.
I think you could learn to recognize fallacies as part of reasoning.
One thing I've been all kind of interested is the limitations of like, are we truly rational? And I would argue that we're not, because if you look at any debate, political debate, basically you're going to decide on your side. You're going to say the one on your side won. I think people in our tribe, we actually take those rational arguments and we consider them, but people in the other tribe, we only consider it if we have to. If there's no, I mean, if it's airtight, there's no possible way to getting out of it.
But doesn't that show you something important?
Like,
that that we rationalize our side as rational.
what do you mean?
So there's an underlying assumption that we operate on the basis of rationality.
Well, to an extent, I think. I mean, I think we have much of our reasoning is motivated. Like, it's very unlikely to convince someone who, say, is against abortion to be for it or pro-choice. If we're the more emotional we are about something, the less rational I would say we are about it.
Can I contribute to that? I just wanted to say, like, well, the difference between like something about abortion is that that's a value statement versus like a fact, which is objective. So like science can't really cover things that have to do with our values, or like personal statements that we believe in, but like facts that are science, basically by using the scientific method, we can come up with facts that are objective. And then those are kind of like the domains of something that that we can be rational. But I mean, I do kind of see what you're saying.
Is that really true?
It is true, yeah.
I mean,
so there is that book, what's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's considered a bit of a key work, a masterpiece in that field, where it shows more or less that revolutions in science happen when people die. When schools of logic based on some aspect of science, they lose support when the keepers of the flame just pass on, so that new people can come in and think about it a different way.
Yeah.
So again, that shows us something, right?
Gary, on your point about emotion and values versus logic, but something like on the argument about abortion, that even though that might cause people to be impassioned and emotional, it would rely on judgments about science, like the viability of life at a certain age and things like that, wouldn't it?
So like I do know that the science is used to shape our values.
Yeah.
So like the science creates the facts, and then we use those facts to try to shape our values.
I think it might be the revert. Like, science has pretty much proven that global warming is caused by man, but half the country doesn't want to believe that science because they already, I don't know why exactly, but based on their own emotional feelings about it.
Isn't that the default case? Isn't that just how people are?
I believe so.
So here's a simple example. So what is 2 + 2, right? It's 4. But if someone who has authority over you, say your boss's boss, sends out email to everyone, or at an all hands says that 2 + 2 is 22. So if I were to ask you what 2 + 2 is equal, well, everyone knows what the answer is, what the right, quote unquote, right answer is, right? So that's a pretty common case of human behavior. In fact, it's a very normal human behavior, right? And we like to talk about how we're very logical because it makes us look better, but how we actually behave is very different.
Right, and I agree, and I think we have to, it's just learning to think scientifically and like questioning authority and stuff, like being able to question authority and not always trust authority, because you have scientists who are professionals and they make mistakes about their own research that they do when they come to conclusions. So it's knowing, you have to know how to think like
well, it's definitely something you can learn to do better, but it seems pretty evident that's not something we're good at or are inclined to do without training.
Yeah, I agree.
So Mike, you've got your hand up, and then Daniel after Mike.
I think DLJ was first.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you kindly. Great presentation. I liked a good summary. Appreciate it a lot. I made some notes, but it's kind of 6 o'clock on a Monday morning here, so these are not very coherent notes. Slide 13, I think it was, deduction and induction. Maybe add something on abduction, given that diagnostic systems, for example, is something that picks up on that kind of thing. The best possible answer kind of thing. So so then that takes us to degrees of certainty, right? So we've got different degrees of certainty with deduction, induction, and abduction. So maybe that is an angle to go down.
The fourth one is analogy, by the way.
And indeed analogy. Yes, there you go.
Those are the four kinds of inferences that can be made in reasoning.
There you go. Extra tips. The other thing was, I don't know where you want to take this in future, but I was wondering if you want to go to machine learning AI kind of thing. perhaps add in the idea that logic, or at least deductive logic certainly, is a process. So you've got input, process, output. Once you've got output, then you've got a potential feedback loop. You might even want to add in DIKW, you probably know that one, data. I say data because I've lived in Australia too long. Data, information, knowledge, wisdom, which of course is not in the system, it's the decision-making stuff. But anyway, you've got the idea of the learning set gives you the new data, and your feedback loop, right? So your output becomes your input, and then that's where you start getting to the ideas of things like machine learning. So that was the things I was thinking if you were planning on taking this all the way to the AI kind of stuff. I don't know if that helps or hinders. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. As far as abduction goes, with term logic, I think that's what Aristotle classified as hitting on the middle term. So what's the explanation for something? And the example he used that I remember was that, okay, suppose you see a man talking to a money lender in the marketplace. What's the explanation for that? He needs a loan. So you've hit on basically, though, in term logic, I think abduction is kind of built into it. But if you can hit on what Aristotle called hitting on the middle term, so it's because the guy needs a loan. I mean, when you're looking at a guy talking to the money lender in the marketplace, they don't wave a sign that says, I'm making him a loan. You just hit on that. That's the explanation. So it's kind of built into term logic. See what I mean? But anyway, as far as Brett analogy and these other reasoning methods, I only went with a very, very basic. Here's your individual, here's your particular, here's your universal in a straight chain like that. But there's, I mean, traditional logic, like, I mean, they've got like, it's pretty sophisticated. So it's you've got all, and Hegel went quite a ways with it too. As far as what you described, DLJ, okay.
Yeah, DLJ.
As far as that process of input what's been learned, and then I mean, basically that's kind of it sounds like a reinforcement AI type of scheme, a learning scheme based upon reinforcement feedback loops. So there's a lot of research going on there. I mean, there's kind of a question in like large models as far as how they can handle, crazy combinations of things. And the conference last week on AGI, there was a lot of, I mean, the AGI crowd is not that crazy about large models, but getting used to the fact that they're extremely powerful. But as far as their capacity to learn how to, as far as the capacity of a large model like ChatGPT to be able to reason, in some kind of situation which it hasn't really seen before, that it's got a lot of novel characteristics, it can't do it that well. But anyway, this is mostly a philosophy presentation.
So it's Daniel next, and then Tim.
Oh, thanks. I mean, there's so many issues I want to bring up, but let me try with rationality, that it's got to be placed in a context. So there's two areas where it appears we behave irrationally, but there's reasons for it. So I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's research of what he calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 is you make very, very fast decisions, given that too much uncertainty, and you have to decide quickly, and you make the best decision under the circumstance. And then when you analyze it deeper, System 2, you find, hey, that was a stupid decision, or that was wrong. That's almost irrational, but that's not true. It's within the context of the situation. That's one example. The other example that comes to mind is a psychiatrist, R.D. Laing, who argued that what we consider schizophrenia in many cases is irrational, but he says it's actually very adaptive for that person. for the problems that he has, and that's probably the best way for that person to handle those conflicts. So there's countless of examples where rationality is dependent on the context and what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think what Mike referred to partly is, I think, internal and external. So, you know, you're consistent within yourself, but again, that's relative to that internal perspective. And from another perspective, if you look at it externally, it could be irrational, or if your motive is external, then that's rational again. So without putting rationality in a context, I'm not sure how meaningful it is. And that's just one thought. I'll come back to some other ideas, but I don't know if you can respond to that, Mike, or anybody.
That makes perfect sense to me.
So Tim, over to you.
No, just to respond briefly to Daniel. Yeah, we do, especially if I guess went to school, quote unquote, for this sort of thing. We tend to think a lot about our thinking in terms of rationality. That's just sort of how people get trained in the field. When really, if you look at our only approximation to human thinking with these large transformer models, they're not rational at all. Like that, there's no function of rationality within them, and yet they work surprisingly well. So that's something to think about. I actually had a question for Mike. He mentioned that conference, I think it was last week, by looking at the meetup link. I think you referenced that in a comment. So I was just wondering if there's a lot of people currently who try to engineer this, meaning, so we have this working thing with large language models, which are transformers plus the stuff in post-training. And it's the closest thing we have to approximating human behavior. And that's done from the very technical side. It's like transformers are pretty sophisticated math. So I was wondering if there's a lot of people who try to work on that kind of stuff, but take it a little bit more, take their work a little bit more philosophically, if that makes sense.
Well, there is. There's kind of an approach where of creating AI. And some other people I know can answer this pretty well, but anyway, where you try to copy this mental structure and the behavior of but you really want things that to build into, to include in your design, things like short-term memory, long-term memory, episodic memory, perceptions, and there's an approach in which you try to build your AI by copying the human structures to a great extent. And there's kind of another approach where you build AI by using a lot of mathematics. You've got the transformer, and you feed it in a lot of data, and then or a massive amount of data, and then you execute some additional training based upon what your particular need is. Use reinforcement, and as you guys know, that the second approach is what's really working right now, and it's working like really well too. But so there's always been this, and the approach which tries to copy the structure of the human mind to a great extent has not really delivered that much. That approach, cognitive architectures, is well represented in the AGI community, and has been for a long time. We had Antonio Lieto a couple of years ago, and he wrote a book on cognitive architectures, and basically his opinion was that transformers just don't understand anything at all. So there's a lot of contention going on within the community as far as what's the best approach, but transformers are working like crazy. I mean, personally, I think that some combination of large models, and it doesn't have to be just language. Large models can also include images, auditory information, and other sense modes. So it's not just large language models, large multimodal models. Take that in conjunction with some elements of cognitive architectures, which copy the structure of the mind more, and then add in robotics, and there's your AGI, I think, eventually. But you can get a long way with just a large model. Like, here's your sense input and here's your goal. Feed that into the large model, take some action. What's the environment? Feed that back in. Keep a circular feedback loop going. There's your AGI right there. But so there's a massive amount of work going on.
Yeah, so the reason I mentioned that is, yeah, you spoke to like, oh, we need memory and model, which does exist in transformer models. It's what they call the MLP layers, the multi-layer perceptron layers between the attention layers, which seem to be use more technical terms, like they overfit the data more than the attention layers, which are more the relational logic between words. Like Wittgenstein would have really appreciated this sort of thing. So, but they don't. Like these things are pretty obviously like a very brute force way to emulate human language. They need a shit ton of data to even work. Way more than a human would ever be trained on. But they do work well. But they have the downside. They can't handle very simple everyday behavior. For example, let's use an example. If we were walking like down a path and we were hungry and we see a tree with fruit on it, but the lower hanging fruit is already picked, right? So I say to you, oh, if you stand on my shoulder or something, we can go reach the fruit. So if we think about what's going on in there, LLM can't replicate that because it has no, at the very least, a world model of how standing on somebody's shoulder works to get to the fruit. It just, like, however you use it to reason with trees or chains or whatever, it only has this history of stuff that people have said and cannot really infer proper things about the world around us. So that's why I asked my question, because people talk about AGI a lot with respect to LLMs, and you can kind of see the how that might work in the sense that because transformers are very general purpose logic units in a sense. Oh, if you just use enough of them and use a bunch of data, like you can extract a lot of context between things in general, and you use the sort of the token generation mechanism to pop things off in a way that kind of makes sense to other people. But I haven't seen a lot of like open effort to make them correspond to the real world very much. Anyway, that's why I asked whether it's something that people kind of talk about at these conferences.
Oh yeah, talked about.
Mike, you're muted.
I think somebody, Elizabeth, are you still there?
Oh yeah, sure. So it's Kalyani next, and then Lance.
Hi.
Like my understanding to this reasoning is very simple, that you just put the logic to some specific set of data and you just derive some conclusions out of it. So here is the thing, like the quality of the reasoning is actually depends upon both the correctness of the logic applied and also the truth of the premises. So the reasoning is both the law of logic to correctly derive some conclusion, which is based on the fact which is provided in the premises. So we can say that yes, reasoning, some of the reasoning is like, some innate abilities that people actually have, and some of the reasoning people develop learning through experiences like observation or interaction and problem solving. In some of them, like basically some of them like practice and then they develop some kind of reasoning. So some of them also have some other factors which are affecting our reasoning ability. Can be some role of reflection, like um, suppose reflecting on somebody's thought process and decision. So these factors helps improve the skills. So we cannot just confine to one particular logic, but yes, the correctness of it along with the truth premises, I think we can develop some better reasoning. That's my take on this.
Okay. Guess I'm next. Yeah, I just had a couple thoughts. I know there's been some claims that LLMs do not reason, and I'm not sure. Like there's something called chain of thought reasoning for LLMs, where you prompt it with, think step by step before writing out your answer, and it does. It writes out its reasoning based on that. And I mean, what do we do? What is reasoning for humans? It's basically subvocal words, chain of words, that we don't know where that comes from. Comes from our unconscious. So to me, that's very similar. But it is true that these LLMs, I was just watching a YouTube by Francois Chollet. He's a Google DeepMind researcher, and he's saying, yeah, he doesn't think they're reasoning, doesn't think they're very intelligent because they only interpolate between samples in their training data. They do not extrapolate beyond their training data, which humans can do. And I think it does take reasoning to do that, to extrapolate beyond. So that's one thing I've been thinking about. I don't know if anyone has ideas on how do you create a system that can extrapolate beyond the training data?
Well, those systems can attempt to extrapolate.
Yeah, and they
just don't.
They do generalize. There is
so in the same way that we can try to extrapolate, we seem to do a better job of it. In part, I think, because we have something that we call, you can call a world model, that we have some understanding of how the world works in a way that these LLMs, they just don't really, because they're not designed that way.
Well, they do have some, I mean, they have basically the whole internet of training data. So you can ask it how cars work. You can ask about how anything works.
Yeah, but the way they understand how cars work is a very rhetorical way. They don't have a model inside really of car functionality, like an engineer, like a way an engineer would understand, like how the gears mesh or whatever. They have relationships between like word tokens that they can spit out in a way that. So here's a like a maybe an example, an observation of how they work internally. So in order to do logic, it's math, right? So we have concepts of how numbers relate to each other in a way that's deeper than, oh, 1 is a word, 2 is a word, 3 is a word, right? That we can see these things in ascending order as along a scale of increasing quantity. So there could be there is concepts like that embedded in those LLMs. The way they use embeddings is they have a vector that's like 10,000 dimensions or something like that, and you can do little tricks to show that along some of these dimensions, let's say at least one, would be some concept of size, right? Like one versus like two versus one would be further along in that dimension for
Yeah.
like a certain way of like describing like these are just large matrices of numbers, and one, if you sort of correlate it with that thing, it would just be not as far along as two in that dimension, as the word two in that dimension. So yes, but the thing I would point out is some of these other dimensions would be odd things that you can interpret as, say, gender or these kind of concepts. That's how these things work. They try to distill relationships between words, and they manage to distill that, you know, the word two is further along in one dimension than one.
Yeah, they don't have a vision.
So the reason I point that out is because, I mean, they seem to be able to derive very primitive ways of doing quote unquote math, but it's a very tiny part of their functionality. So to say that, oh, they're able to use logic or whatever seems a little spurious, because it's such a tiny part of their actual functionality.
Can I interject something? I was kind of hoping we could have this from like a philosophical point of view, if possible. I don't know, LLM arguments. You know, I get into them so often, but, or at least I do. I mean, we can argue whether they understand it or not. They kind of do, but it's a very primitive understanding. But I don't know. That's just my Lance. If you want to keep talking LLMs, okay.
I'm just, I don't know. It's just interesting. Like I don't know if anyone else is interested there. That Francois Chalet, he has the ARC challenge, is kind of an AGI challenge. It'd be $1 million in prizes this year. Just look it up. It's interesting. But yeah.
Do you find his presentation convincing? I did. I thought it was pretty good. Chalet's
Which
point.
one?
I think it's the same point. He's basically saying that they're large. Here I am talking about large models.
He puts a lot of emphasis on extrapolation.
I mean, there's a fixed limit you can't advance beyond.
Yeah.
Basically. Anyway.
Yeah, it's true that humans like we're much better at taking very few samples and learning from that.
So if I could address Tio's comment, he put it out in chat that maybe the world model is somehow being stored, that we just can't really interpret it very well from the way it's being stored. And so one thing to look at, so think about how we tend to think about that example I gave about numeracy. That some people, when they look at words like 10 versus 100 versus 1,000, they think of them more along a number scale, whereas people who are less numerate, I guess, they just think of them as separate words, and they don't quite have that cognitive model that 1,000 is 100 times bigger than 10, that they're just words. So there's quite a bit of range in how we're able to apply our machinery to these sort of quantitative concepts, I guess. So there's no reason to think that if you train a model a certain way versus another way, that they necessarily have the same. You can say that, oh, they have a certain world model, like they have these kind of disparate concepts embedded within, like, oh, one of the embedding vector dimensions would be quantity or something like that. But there's no guarantee. It's just sort of some concept that I picked up from looking at a lot of text. So you could say, oh, it's more likely that it's able to pick up basic logic. For example, oh, it reads the Three Little Pigs, and then what does the wolf do? It huffs and puffs and then blows the house down. So that's akin to a logical and if it sees a lot of those examples there, it would reinforce the patterns that some pattern within for logical anding stuff, right? But it's just a statistical property of the text that it's seen. So it's very hard to. So yes, there's some statistical correlation within the model with the text that it has seen, but it's a kind of a different. It might be the similar mechanism as to how we pick up a world model, but just from the data that it sees, it's a very, like, if you only exposed a child to reading books, like the world model within would be very, very different than a human.
So I just have one comment.
Yeah, I was just go ahead, Lance. Sorry.
Just one comment. So Ilya Sutskever, former chief scientist of OpenAI, was talking about this. But yeah, sure, it's all text. They don't have vision. Well, some mostly, but he's talked about the embeddings that form for things like color, like pink versus red. And they're looking at the embedding space, like the distance between those vectors was much closer than, say, red versus blue. So he's saying that you can learn visual concepts, the LMs can, it just takes a lot longer because it's not the same modality.
I was wondering if anybody from this was a dual meetup with philosophy and AGI. If anybody from the philosophy side wanted to chime in, had a comment, because we've been talking large models for a while. It's always on my mind anyway. I'm kind of tired of it. Nothing.
From my perspective, I'm interested in the overlap between philosophy and psychology, because for me, there isn't such a thing as logic, in the sense that humans are inherently flawed and biased. And so I question the degree to which human beings, this is a general statement, are capable of rationality and reason, because there's so much pressure from social norms, from a survival instinct where you're willing to lie and agree that 2 + 2 is 5 just to get ahead or not be socially ostracized, for example. So the overlap between philosophy and psychology, I guess, is of interest to me. And if anyone wants to comment on that, I don't know, Victor, if you would like to.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Well, what's in my mind right now is actually the next topic, at least for the philosophy groups, on causation. In philosophy, there's been a long controversy as to what causation is, what the concept is. Going back to David Hume, who said that it's a psychological concept. Basically, we see one thing followed by another with a great amount of frequency, and we get, like Pavlov's dog, we get trained into thinking that the first thing that happens is the cause of the second thing, and that's all it is. It's nothing more than correlation or constant conjunction, as he calls it. But many philosophers have thought, no, it's got to be more than that. There's something called necessary, because that's how do you tell the difference between a correlation and a actual causality? And we seem to think that causation is more than than correlation, and many philosophers, especially recently, have defended that idea. But I'm not sure to what extent this applies to the AI world, but there's been a recent move among statisticians to say that if you have enough data, or they call it the big data movement, you can dispense with needing to even entertain the notion of causation. You can just, with enough data, you can function adequately with correlations. That you can just, because Hume suggested that maybe there isn't any such thing as causation except our mental tendency we have, because that we evolved, but there's no actual entity or thing in the world to which the word causation answers to. There is correlation; one thing follows another in time. But anyway, I'll be exploring this in more detail in the next topic that I do, but it does involve the questions about to what extent our understanding of what makes things happen is a psychological thing, and very specific to our evolved tendencies, but in the real world there is nothing that answers to the question of causation. That's a controversial point, but it is, I think, related to this, especially if it can be shown that what we want from causation is we can get without there being, without there having the concept. For example, one philosopher says what we really want when we're asking for what causes something, we want either an explanation, a prediction, or that's the prediction, or we want to see, there's a third thing. Oh, we want to manipulate the world in some way. That's why we ask for causes. If you can get that without having the concept, then why do we have the concept at all? And there are suggestions that it is possible to just deal purely with correlations and forget causes. But anyway, that's a whole other topic, which I'll maybe talking about next time. I don't know if this was at all relevant to your point.
Right, it's the state of the art in large models. It is just all correlation.
Yeah. Well, Hume was saying that's all we have either. We see one thing after another, and we get trained into thinking, well, the first thing causes the second, and that's it. There's no more to it than that. That's, as I said, controversial, but
yeah, well, I haven't heard anybody really defending that, and it seems like the large model crowd could take up that argument.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was somewhat relevant, because if you could get, I mean, okay, the main question is what do we want from causation? What are we asking about when we ask for what is the cause for something? We have a motivation, mostly because we want to explain things. But why do we want to explain things? In order to maybe predict things, because it might be useful to us, because we want to manipulate future events. So it's helpful to know what it is that brought them about. But if we can get those three goals satisfied without introducing anything but massive correlation, then what do we causation might be barking up a tree that there's nothing up that tree to bark at anymore. If we have mass, it's like a brute force way of answering, getting the goals that causation is we're trying to get via causation through brute force, rather than a new concept that called causation.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Victor, I think for the next for this causality meetup coming up in philosophy, which I'll list it under the AGI forum too, because causality is huge, huge issue right now. It's all correlation.
Yeah, and well, what makes it controversial is that they're suggesting that even for people it's correlation. Well, we may be thinking it's something else, but Hume said it is correlation for us as well.
So Victor, let me ask you a question.
Had their hand up for a while, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to address this one point. May I?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel, and then Darlene can speak after.
Okay, because I sort of agree with you, that it's induction is where we get most of our knowledge. But let's take a case where you make a prediction in science. And for example, let's say Einstein's theory of relativity shows that light rays bend around gravitational fields. So he made a prediction and it turned out to be true. And you say, why does the light bend? Because of the gravitational field of the moon. So that seems to be a causal explanation, but probably not sufficient, because then you'll ask, well, how does the gravity bend it? So again, it's within a context that you can issue, then you can answer causality. What's your take on that?
Get to the same conclusion with simply noticing repetitions, lots of correlations. You run this experiment and you get those results. And I mean, what the idea is that correlation can do it all for you. What do you need this extra thing called causality in there to? What does it do for you that you couldn't get in theory anyway from just correlation? If the idea is that you're going to get the answer, that doesn't quite connect with the rest of science. You get tentative answers in science. You get science is in the business of what was it? The knowledge obsolescence. In other words, whatever we know now, the point of science is to make sure it becomes obsolete later through more information about the world. It's always a tentative thing, and you can get that with tentative conclusions, and you can get that with lots of correlations. The idea that there's a cause that is the end of the line, the end of the line as far as explanations go, is really doesn't happen in science. You
keep asking why and why. Yeah, agreed. But in some contextual level, it is a cause, sort of.
Right. In the context is human psychology. That was Hume's point. That but how does that map onto the real world, though? And that was where the controversy lies. Because there are some philosophers who will define that there is such a thing as what they call it law-like behavior. There are rules that are governing the universe. That if we can tap into those rules, we will have a deeper understanding. And they're not about our psychology. They're actually operating and shaping the world we live in. That's an alternative view to the one that's being suggested by Hume. But that's where the controversy lies as to which of this, which is more convincing to people. There really is such a thing as causation independent of us, or is it causation exists only because of who and what we are?
I've been listening from the beginning, and I just want to interject this because I know Darlene's waiting, but it's exactly on this topic. It's the perfect moment for this. So the difference between causation and correlation is that the word cause is introduced in, and I'm speaking in Anglo, line of reasoning, is basically a legal term, right? It's really your grievance. Someone has a grievance. So that's great because you don't have that in correlation. Basically, these things go together. It happened. It works in both directions, right? But a cause, a grievance, is identifies as somebody as having the complaint and wanting to something else. This is the injection of values. So I think that's sort of why we could say that machines don't understand cause because they don't have any skin in the game, so to speak. So that's just a thought that I wanted to get out while I had it, and I think it could lead to something else.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jeff. I mean, I'll be talking more about that later, but yeah, I think you're right. Darlene,
over to Darlene now, then I think. Darlene, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Sorry, I had stepped away because people were talking. So I was just gonna say, like, to specifically, just really quickly to the point where you talked about people lying to saying the math equation where that's wrong just to get food. I was gonna say simply that it depends upon what level the value of truth telling is to that person, because the way I think of it is, the core value of lying could be either the really high, the most important, one of the most important core values to a person, which I would say is level 1. Then it could be a secondary value to a person, or it could be a third level value, or fourth level is just where it's an ethical value. So where people's ethical values is actually the farthest, where they do it, they tell it the truth just to be truthful in society. So if the person who's lying to get the food, if truth telling is just an ethical value to them, then it's not going to be the same to that person as somebody who truth telling is a core value, and it's not even a secondary, third level. Like, it depends upon the level of the values to that person, whether or not they're going to reason how long they're going to starve. A person who, if it's their core value, they're going to starve themselves for a while before they're going to get that food. So before they're going to reason, man, I need to get the food. That's all I was going to say.
Well, we are pretty sophisticated reasoning machines in the sense that, like we understand our interests pretty well, right? So we tend not to starve because we prioritize not starving and figure out ways to not starve. That makes sense. Like our primary values aren't, really telling the truth or whatever. That's sort of a tool that's available, if it's useful to that goal. But our minds are actually pretty sophisticated reasoning machines, but not in the logical way, like the sort of the strict logical way. They're pretty powerful computers when it comes to like seeking gradients or stuff like that. Like the actual computation power within is like beyond supercomputer level in some sense. It's very good at finding statistical correlations between things like, this sort of behavior leads to getting food or whatever. If that makes sense. I think a lot of the, and I kind of blame philosophy for this, that the way we tend to, how rational people think about the world is very colored by the history of how philosophy kind of came about. It's not, they didn't really have a good understanding of like, let's say statistics or statistical correlation, and that's how the brain actual work, the way the brain actually works to kind of function in our world. Like the way that computer evolved is quite different than how it's usually presented in a 101 class. So that's worth pondering, instead of using a basis of strict logic. That's how that's taught. Anyway.
I'm trying to understand, were you disagreeing with me?
What I usually try to point out when these discussions talk about logic is that it's not really how human brains work. So if you try to frame our world in terms of logic, you wouldn't necessarily get the kind of understanding that people hope for in that endeavor, if that makes sense. So if you try to understand swimming, try to be good at swimming, but you just talk about Newton's laws all day, that's not, they're sort of tangential topics in a sense.
So I see Daniel K's got his hand up. Daniel K.
Yeah, no, I'm just reacting to what you said. I think, again, it depends on the situation. Sometimes you use logic to solve certain problems, and sometimes you react emotionally. And again, I guess I'm pushing again this idea of contextualism. But I was just thinking, somebody gave an example of 2 + 2 is 4, and then you said, well, 22, and I don't know if you meant that as a possibility. But you know, if you say 2 and 2 are 5 is irrational. But then I thought 2 and 2, 22. Yeah, 2 and 2 is 4 is a mathematical operation. 2 and 2, 22 is a visual operation. So if I answer it's 22, you'll think I'm crazy. I'm irrational. But I can give it a context and say, hey, you know, give it to some child and he'll say 22. Just picking up on that example you gave before.
Yeah, the reason I gave that example was more to show that what's actually going on when we talk about things. So everyone here kind of understands how loyalty works, because your boss saying 2 plus 2 is 22. It is a loyalty test. So like 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a terrible loyalty test because it's true, right? But 2 plus 2 is 22 is an excellent loyalty test because it's obviously untrue. So I was just using that example to illustrate what's going on in everyday life isn't sort of truth-telling logic operations. It's a different kind of game. There's a difference in kind to how we sometimes teach people how the mind works.
I know what you mean by loyalty, but I take it out of context. And let's say if a 5-year-old child said it's 22, you'll understand he's being rational given his knowledge. So, but I don't think we disagree here. So, but just different context.
Victor, do you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I was going to add another example to Daniel's about how the importance of context, even very, very narrow context, like 2 plus 2 is actually 3.83 or something like that if you're mixing 2 cups of water with 2 cups of alcohol, because that's what you get. You get less than 4 cups of liquid. It's the chemical reaction. So in the context of chemistry and understanding how water and alcohol mix, they actually don't equal 4. But that's a very specific context. It's not arithmetic. It's how two quantities of one thing and 2 quantities of another don't, in certain contexts, add up to 4. It's just to reinforce Daniel's point, I think. About context.
And just to point out very quick, so there's another way to understand that, like a loyalty test, right? You can understand it as like more technically as, let's say, game theory, because again, if you want to get food, get fed at the end of the day, you know what to say in that example. So in your head, there's actually a fairly sophisticated operation going on that we usually don't expose, because we all understand how that game works, and yet nobody really talks about it very much. But yeah, it is sometimes I think a little unfortunate. Sometimes a 101 text talks about like logical rules, basically talks about in terms of math, even though it's possible to understand game theory as math and what's actually going on in conversations. So when you say different context, yeah, it is a different context that could be understood technically, but it's just not often presented that way.
Hey, Jim Bromer, did you want to talk about what you were looking at in psychology? I don't know if you're still there. Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. I guess do you want to say a couple words? Because I noticed you were working on
Not
it.
really. I did have something to say about defeasible reasoning, though. I think what we're talking about would be called defeasible reasoning, and the Stanford Encyclopedia Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy said that reasoning is defeasible when the corresponding argument is rationally compelling, but not deductively valid. The truth of the premises of a good defeasible argument provides support for the conclusion, even though it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. In other words, the relationship of support between premises and conclusion is a tentative one, potentially defeated by additional information. And I think so abductive reasoning is defeasible, heuristics are defeasible, neural networks are defeasible, and so on. Probability nets are, I assume, too. So I think my opinion is that all of our thinking, all of our reasoning starts out like this, and we can, over a period of time, learn to improve our reasoning about some subject, and we can learn to be better at reasoning. And the other thing I said that wanted to say that the one thing that was really pretty important is how well it works. So if you've got some extrinsic feedback or measurement, then you can see if that reasoning makes sense or not. So that's pretty much all I really wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks. Well, all right. Anybody else, or do we just call it a day? We're almost out of time anyway.
I was just triggered by that last thought and thinking about error correction. So that's a massive thing when it comes to how humans think, isn't it? You got the predictive model, and then you've got your error correcting, which was just hinted at a minute ago. Yeah, was it?
I just wanted to put forward an idea that would be like another avenue, which is good for the end. Just save this for another time, maybe. But the way that maybe, and I got more interested in this meeting when I realized that it was the meeting of the two camps, which I think there's a lot more even to be said about that. So you could even have another one of these. I mean, I guess maybe both camps will be available for causality. And maybe this could be tied into that, which is that we didn't take a game theoretic viewpoint basically. We talked about people having needs like impressing the boss, and then what should be added to that is that we sort of adjudicate and open that issue by playing a game that we call reasoning, or whatever other games we want to play, that basically determines, at least has a possibility of declaring a victor. That's what people are motivated to play the game, because then I'll be on the winning side. So I think that's sort of a way to sort of unite things, because then you have rules. That's where you can get rules in. They're the rules of the game now instead of the laws of nature. I think that's sort of a nice meta framework to sort of conduct these conversations. I mean, obviously, programs work by rules, although they do, they have a lot of individual moving parts, of variables, I guess they're called. But if they're still mechanical, right? So you have this you can sort of keep up this pretense of always following a rule, and thus being deterministic. I'm surprised that word doesn't come up that much today. But really though, so we're playing the game voluntarily, and one can always walk away. But of course, if you walk away, you don't win. Maybe you don't lose, but you definitely don't win if you walk away from the game. So that's just sort of that's sort of a way to import the sociology into it, which sort of was mentioned at the beginning with the Enigma of Reason by Mercier, and my favorite, and I'm forgetting his name because it's been a while since he wrote a book, but that's sort of my basic authority to beat. And they don't do it either. They don't get that much into the interpersonal or the social psychology of it. But I think that's sort of where it needs to go. And artificial and general intelligence, that basically really, I probably mentioned it before. I mean, that was the approach I was looking at when I was in school, and I stopped because all they wanted to do was artificial intelligence, basically, by rules, lots of rules. And so I always feel vindicated by the turn of events 20 years later that this happens. But I think that basically works. I think that well, we're gonna see it pretty soon. I think that basically that there isn't. We all talk about now that it's like, well, it's the internet, it's everything, but you could easily build, I'm sure, one of these large language modules on some subset of the things that you like to say, and then you can get an agent that imitates you, not the generalized public. And so that gets you back into this idea of games and teams and so forth. And then you can go on more from that about the sociological models of competition and that teamwork and so forth. So I think that's a way to get it open to that. Of course, if people don't want to go that way because they don't like to think about other people, which is a typical philosopher thing, then I don't know. I don't yet have any help for those people, but that's sort of the direction I think all this points in. It's just been quite an interesting thing. I'm so tired. The only reason I'm here, I can't promise to be here for any of these because I'm usually out on Sunday, but I kind of crashed last night, and so I was here. And oh, look at this! They're talking about reasoning. So thanks everybody.
Good to hear from you, Jeff. Thanks. Yeah, you can build your own large model pretty easily now, I think, or add. Basically, I think you're adding on to an existing one, with whatever you want, whatever band of knowledge.
Yeah, so just to add on really quickly to what you were saying about the sort of sociology. I mean, one way to, for example, I was just using the example of like a loyalty test, right? But in a sense, that is the solution to the prisoner's dilemma, like these sort of tragedy of the commons problems that you need to build trust. Like the reason why the prisoners in the prisoner's dilemma kind of fail is that they don't trust each other. So there are what we can consider rational reasons to behave in a traditional sense that we could call irrational ways, like everyone saying that 2 + 2 is 22 would on its face appear irrational, but it's rational in the game theoretic sense that if everybody can be counted on to trust each other, it's a solution to the prisoner's dilemma type problems or the tragedy of the commons. Victor,
I loved all your comments. I just wanted to thank you for the phrase, which I hadn't had at the tip of my tongue before, the loyalty test. Yeah, it very much does come down to a loyalty test. But the loyalty test is always adjudicated by the leader. so don't think that we're going to find the loyalty test, but it's a class of arguments that are used as loyalty test, as that's the model. Yeah. So thanks for that.
It just seems like there should be some kind of clear boundary between the rational and the irrational, but if there's overlapping motives, then some behavior might be rational under one strategy and irrational under another strategy. So it's not so simple.
There is a clear boundary. It's the friend-enemy distinction. that is the gulf between them. It's like they're on the other side. The irrational people are on the wrong side, so to speak.
Well, I mean, that's, I guess, a form of rationality. Well, any last comments? We've got a couple more minutes, or we can just wrap it up, I guess.
I guess just throw out another idea: rationality between. No, I lost my train of thought. Let's say, like religion is irrational on one level and rational on another level.
It might be irrational.
Yeah, so you can explain it. You can explain religion and say, hey, it makes sense. It's it does a lot of good, but it's totally irrational. So again, just throwing it out for discussion, and I'd love to get into that one.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's there's a lot of fuzzy boundaries between what's rational, what's irrational, that's just not within the boundaries of rationality, what's irrational, and what's just plain old crazy. I mean, who's going to come up with the calculus to try to determine these kind of boundaries?
But I guess the point that, okay, I was going to make this point before, that how you define your terms, because religion is such a broad category. So what do you mean your religion is rational? It's a meaningless question almost. Is religion rational or not? It's such a, it encompasses so much. So unless you break it down into detail and say, okay, this aspect makes sense, this aspect doesn't make sense, what you concentrate on, but it's too large of a topic. And that's one of the problems in a lot of areas. We don't define our terms properly, and we can't decide if it's rational, if it's psychological, if it's logic, whatever. And defining terms where we are talking on the same level and the same issue, we may have a more meaningful discussion. But it's going to have to be broken down. You know, it's like in politics. You know, what makes America great? And nobody defines it. I don't know. Let's talk issue by issue: health, education, immigration. You know, analyze each topic separately rather than gross, you know, greatness. Same with religion, same with so many issues. If you don't get specific, it becomes a meaningless discussion almost.
So one thing I would point out that's interesting about transformers, and part of why I think they tend to work pretty well is they were kind of created to they were created to solve disambiguation in language. So inherent to how they work is, let's say you have the word program, right? Oh, does that program refer to like computer programming or like a program for an opera or something like that? Or the word rationality, let's say. And inherent to how they work is they try to figure out the relation between that word and the surrounding context. So that's like basically how they were designed, because they were designed by people who worked on language. So they just wanted a way to kind of quantify these relationships. And so they are incredibly good at these very fine distinctions, or maybe not so fine, just distinctions between words. Like inherent to how they work is you have a noun, it's surrounded by some adjectives. They can relate the adjectives to the noun, right, and kind of tweak the meaning of that word. And that's just inherently how they work. I always thought, oh, okay, maybe that's why they kind of work so well, because inherent to the function of how we think is internally is kind of how we, the sort of the power of our thought is in being able to make these contextual sort of contextual distinctions, if that makes sense. Because well, they kind of accidentally hit upon some insight.
For your comment, I got to get out of here and get going. We're out of time, but thanks everybody. Victor, see you pretty soon, and see everybody pretty soon. So I'm wrapping it up. Thanks, Tim. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye now.